Welcome to the Church Resource, where we talk about the best resources for pastors, leaders, and lay people. I'm your host, Jeff Oliver. Today we look at a book called Second Thoughts, 100 Things Small Church Pastors Need to Reconsider. This is by Dave Jacobs. Jacobs comes to writing this book as a church consultant, as one who is a coach for pastors. He comes with 30 years of experience in about 6 churches, and so a wealth of experience that he has in writing this book. So the title is interesting. It's called Second Thoughts, and to be honest, I have second thoughts about this book. And so, when someone asks you, hey, I have good news and I have bad news, which do you want first? I almost always answer, I want the bad news first. I think I just want to be left with the good news there at the end. So if you do just the opposite, then skip ahead a little bit in the podcast, listen for the good news first, and then you can come back and listen to the bad news if that's how you'd like to do it. But I just that's how I'm going to do this today, is talk about the bad news first. What I think this book is lacking is an editor. There are grammatical errors in there. There are word choice errors where there's a homophone where it might be spelled a different way in a different usage, but he uses the wrong one. And there is a whole chapter in here that has a different font than the surrounding chapters, than any of the rest of the book. And so I just think that it suffers from that, because to me, and this might not be fair, it might not be the way you do it, but when I see those kinds of things, they leap off the page out of me like they're in neon or something. And so it really destroys or eats away at the credibility of the author. It makes me not really want to look at the rest of the material and just think that it's all bad because that was handled haphazardly. So I know, again, that's not fair. That's just the way I look at it. And so, again, there were places in the book where there were cut and pasted chapters where I was reading a chapter later in the book, and I thought, well, I've read this before somewhere. And then I'll look earlier in the book, and word for word, just exactly replicated there over to another place. And I thought that's irresponsible authorship, and really could use some sense of just a cohesive message, some continuity through the book, and that will be helped by an editor. Now, that said, I think that also need to point out that after I had read most of the book, I got to the end and had read over 200 pages, and then got to a place where it made me feel that I had read a 200-page infomercial, because he talks in Appendix A, 8 ways that I can help you. Appendix B, 20 ways that I can help your church. Appendix C, 21 reasons why a church might benefit from a consultant. In other words, hey, I'm the coach, I'm the consultant, I wrote this whole book that you've just read, and now let me help you. And here's, by the way, all my contact information. So, I think that I can appreciate somebody marketing themselves, but I didn't think that was an appropriate way to do that. Now, with all of that out of the way, I think that there is a lot of good here. Those are the bones that you spit out after you eat the whole fish, after you read this book. This is a book that has a lot of good information. It has a lot of helpful information to a pastor who is maybe just starting, or maybe it's a pastor who's been at it for a while and keeps coming up with the same issues, keeps coming up against and butting heads with, to be honest, some of the same problems in their ministry, some of the same struggles, and some of the same people. Sometimes, even if it's a different church, you're going to run into some of the same people, the same types of people. And this is where I think that this book would be so helpful to somebody dealing with those things. Jacobs says that you might want to think of Second Thoughts like you would a reference book or manual, and you could read it from start to finish, or you could look through the table of contents and pick a few chapters that relate to situations that you're dealing with. And as one pastor I talked to who recommended this book said, you might look at it as kind of a bathroom book. And so let's explain that. These chapters are 1, 2, 2.5 pages of content, and so they are titled then with some version of reconsider, reconsider X, reconsider Y. And so they're very quick to read. You can just scan that one issue that you want to deal with, or again, you can read it from start to finish, which I did. So this is something that's infinitely usable, that you can reference it often. And so here's one example. I'll just go through a few of the chapters that I picked out to give you kind of an example or some of the resources that are in this book. And he says, first chapter, reconsider this idea that it's your job to grow the church. In other words, Pastor, the question that came to him was, how do you balance pastoring the current flock and evangelizing in your community? How do you recruit people in your church to help with both? And so he gives some questions back. Well, what does evangelizing your community look like to you? Where did you get the idea that this is part of your call? In other words, Pastor, are you not gifted? Is that not part of your gift mix? Is evangelism? Then maybe that's not the goal for you to be in this church. Now, every believer, he does make the point, is called to be an evangelist, is called to tell people about Jesus, but not necessarily called to be an evangelist and to grow the church exponentially. That's not always the case. And so I appreciate that Jacobs makes that point very clear in this book. Also, he says that we need to consider this idea of pastor as rancher. So what that comes from is that there's been this idea, this theme that has been coming up, that a pastor should not be seen so much as a shepherd, which is, by the way, exactly what the word pastor means, but it's more of a rancher, that we oversee, we kind of manage the whole situation, overseeing the functioning of the church, and so that we can be outside of the individual shepherding of one person or one family, or that those kind of day-to-day things are not something we need to be a part of. And Jacob says no, especially in the small church. This is so crucial that you be involved in the lives of people as necessary, as what is appropriate, whatever they're comfortable with, of course, but in ways that let them know that you are shepherding them, you are with them, and not just kind of from the outside overseeing and getting an overview of the whole situation, but you are interested in being involved in their lives and providing that pastoral support. So back to thinking about the pastor as a shepherd, as a one-on-one kind of help. I think that's very important to this, and Jacobs highlights that well. And so other chapters here that I found were significant that I wanted to mention here is that you need to reconsider if it's you or Jesus building your church. In other words, he gives us kind of exchange here between Jesus and a pastor, and Jesus saying, "Hi, would you mind if I came in and built my church?" And the pastor says, "I appreciate that, Jesus, but I've got it covered." And there's probably no pastor on earth who would say that, who would actually come out and say those words to Jesus, were Jesus asking that question. But, Pastor, do you respond that way many times when you think that, if I don't answer this email, if I don't get that phone call, especially on a day off, if I don't do this, if I don't make that decision right now, if I don't do that, and all these things that really, Pastor, you're taking that control, you're taking the decision making, all the power away from any influence that Jesus could have in this church, in building this church, or in growing this church. And so we're talking about growth in terms of spiritual health as much as numerically, which actually the author here highlights the health aspect more of it than numerical growth. He also says that, by the way, when you violate your days off, that's strong language. When you violate your days off, when you're not taking that day off fully and pulling away from email, from texts, from phone calls, from knocks on the door, when you're not pulling away from those things, not giving the time to your own personal health, your family's time with you, when you're not doing that, you're really doing a detriment to the whole situation, and saying that, first of all, they need me so that the church can be built, so that the church can be quote unquote successful. These people need me, and so therefore I need to leave my family, leave my quiet time, and I need to go and handle these situations in the church. And so when he says that you put that decision off, if you would put off something until tomorrow because your family is waiting for you at home to have dinner, those are really modeling opportunities for your church to say, look, this is what God has called me to, yes, in this ministry, in this pastorate, as a leader of this church, but he's also called me to minister to my family, and this is how I do that. So Jacobs is big on a pastor taking his full day off because as one pastor of mine, a friend of mine told me that he was refusing to take a phone call and did not take that phone call on a day off. And someone called him over and over and then asked him the next day, hey, where were you? I was trying to get a hold of you. Didn't you see my calls? He said, yes, I did, but I didn't want to violate the Sabbath. You wouldn't want me to do that, right? Because God says that we should take a day off. And so, well, of course, the person did not want that pastor to violate that day off. So I think that's a great reminder to us. And Jacobs makes the point many times that we need to guard those times that we have taken off. In fact, he goes a lot further than I have ever thought about doing, in that, yes, Pastor, you need to take your day off per week. You need to take some time off each year to have a vacation with your family, even for you to go off and spend some time in quiet reflection. But also that every couple of years, you need to take some time, and he says, make it anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks of sabbatical. This is crucial that you would take this time and that you would detach and use that time for good, not for you to write a book or for you to come up with another course that you're writing or to make that intensely productive. But you need to take that time so that you can restore your relationship with Jesus, because being a pastor, if you don't know this yet, takes a lot out of you. It takes a lot of mental energy. It takes a lot of spiritual strength to do that. And how can you be the best that you can be for doing the work that God has placed you in that spot to do? How can you be responsible to those people who've called you as their pastor unless you're healthy, unless you have that foundation of a strong relationship with Jesus and a close, intimate prayer life with Him? How can you do that? And so there are some, he mentioned that there are some church boards who would never approve 8 weeks, but he said maybe start with 4 weeks. If there's no way you can get away, then maybe that indicates that there are some other things going on that are wrong with the church. And can the church really not get by without you? Can people not make decisions without you? And so if there is a reason that people say, well, you can't take that much time off, then that indicates there are some other things going on that you need to address and maybe instruct and train and let people know how important it is that you would have that time, and that then to train them to be able to do those things while you're away. Some other key chapters that I thought were they just kind of stood out to me, to reconsider the storms of life and ministry. That, you know, the saying is that you're either heading into a storm, you're in the middle of a storm, or you've just come out of a storm. So how do you deal with those things? He again says that you should think about pulling away rather than staying in and fighting the storm that's going on in your life. Why don't you take a time, maybe take an extra day and pull away from that situation so that you can come back with a clear mind, a clear head, and make that decision that you need to make. Also, and I've already talked about sabbaticals that he talks about, and there were some other pieces here that he says that you should reconsider the whole church growth thing. And he uses this in several chapters of the book. Again, there are 100 chapters, so lots of time to talk about this kind of thing. But the whole church growth, the expansion, the numerical growth of a church is not really the key to why you're there necessarily, But the idea that comes from all these church growth conferences is that all healthy things grow and reproduce. He says, that's a nice phrase, but it's not really true in the context of church growth, of church life, of, again, where he comes down and what he focuses on and emphasizes is church health. And so you need to think about the fact that the church, might be doing good things, might be doing exactly what it's called for. A church should be doing the things that the people in the church are gifted to do. In other words, why are those people there? Why has God given them those particular gifts if they're not being used in that church? And maybe you're trying to do some things in the church that don't use any of the gifts. In other words, there are people not gifted in those things in that church. And so that we need to reconsider, again, the things that are being done and make sure that they're being done well. He talks about how we set up church boards, how we approach church membership, whether we even have church membership, and if we do, why we would maybe have somebody in the church, why we would maybe ask them to reconsider joining that church, or we need to look back into their history with churches. And if we could only take a look at, in other words, kind of do a church background check, not for any criminal acts, but what would be considered destructive to the health of a church, if we knew about that and could go back into a person's past and see what they've contributed to a church, what they've hurt, what they've harmed in terms of other churches they've been a part of. I think these are sacred territories that he talks about. Why would we not allow somebody to be a member of our church? Well, if they're going to erode the health of the church that we already have, then it's probably best to think about that again and walk them through a way of healing and restoration with those past situations so that they can come in and be healthy. He talks about something like excommunication, which he says that Protestants more than likely will talk about disfellowshipping just because it sounds nicer, and certainly wouldn't go as far as to say we're going to kick you out of this church. But we need to talk about that sometimes, and there are biblical examples and reasons that someone would need to have to leave the church. 1 Corinthians 5, he points out that where that situation was resolved, that someone was disfellowshipped, let's say, from the church, and as it turns out, that person came back in a spirit of forgiveness and repentance, and they were restored to the church. And this is important for us to remember and recognize that there are examples in Scripture of how to do this, and really ought to be our model. He even talks about things that are, again, sacred cows to us, like Vacation Bible School. And as he mentions that, it's a smaller example of the larger idea that really throughout this whole book, let's take the things that we do as a church, and you can tell that they are really varied and across the board for the things that are going on in the church. But are we doing them because they're effective, or because we've always done them, or because we just couldn't imagine being a church without doing this or that? And so why are we doing these things? Are they things that we have been called to do? Are they things that we have the right gift mix to do? Are they things that are biblical? So everything that goes on in your church, how do you do it and why do you do it? And let's come back and, as he says so often, reconsider the things that we do and why we do them. One last thing that I'll mention here, and I've touched on this before, that we need to reconsider how nice being nice really is. This is in the section of reconsidering how we deal with church people, with people who are causing problems in the church. And he says that, he gives an example of someone who was plagued with all kinds of symptoms throughout the years, just all kinds of health issues and you can imagine, they just ran the gamut. And as it came down, doctor after doctor, and they never diagnosed and were never able to fix what the issue was. But one day they came down on this one test that revealed to them, and it was very simple, that it was a thyroid issue. All they needed was a pill, and they were able to overcome that thyroid issue, and then all these other symptoms disappeared. They said there might be someone in your church who's like that. It's one simple little problem, but that they're causing damage, they're causing issues, health issues, all over the place and in all throughout the church, and it's just systemic, the issues that they might be causing in your church. And it's time for you to address that, to approach that person, talk with them, and maybe actually be ready to ask them to leave the church if it's appropriate for you to do that. It just might be time to do that. Do you want? He asks and follows up that chapter with, well, do you want a smelly church? In other words, they're causing your church to stink. Do you want a smelly church or a healthy church? You need to treat a low-functioning person the same way you would a low-functioning thyroid, and maybe sometimes cut it out. So those are harsh things that we have to think about sometimes in terms of pastoring a church. But I think they're very important that Dave Jacobs has brought these things up, again, with 30 years of experience, and has really highlighted some things. And again, I know starting out with some of the negatives might make you think, well, I don't need this book. I think you do. I think you need to read this and ignore some of the issues that I gave at the beginning to say, well, there's good content here, and I think it comes from a good spirit, a good author who's obviously experienced in what he's talking about there. So this is one book on my shelf that's been helpful to me throughout my ministry, and I hope it gives you some direction as you prayerfully consider which resources will best help you and the people you're ministering to. Once again, Second Thoughts by Dave Jacobs. Thanks for listening to the Church Resource, and please make sure that you give us a review. And if you have any suggestions of resources that you would like us to look at, just email us at thechurchresource@gmail.com. That's thechurchresource@gmail.com.